welcome to Sidebar, Bracewell's podcast devoted to government enforcement and investigations, corporate compliance, and white-collar criminal defense. I'm Matthew Nielsen.
And I'm Phil Bezanson.
And we are your host, and we are both partners at Bracewell LLP, where we represent companies, boards of directors, and individuals in all manners of litigation, investigation, and enforcement actions. Phil, this episode is going to be a little bit different. This is going to be just you and I, so no guest today, but we do have a pretty interesting topic. You want to introduce what we're going to talk about?
That's right. So last week, we saw our first big white-collar criminal trial verdict of 2022. That was in United States against Elizabeth Holmes, which many of you might think of as the Theranos trial. So this trial, which was held in federal court in San Jose, it lasted roughly 3 months. And I think one of the things that we're going to dig into that was sort of most interesting about how the trial ended was that we really had a truly mixed verdict.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, ultimately, Ms. Holmes is absent some kind of motion for new trial being granted or an appeal, which probably are somewhat unlikely in both cases. She is going to go to prison, but not quite the slam dunk victory that I think the government maybe had hoped for.
Yeah. And, just to break it down a little bit and why this is truly a mixed verdict, you had ultimately 11 counts that went to the jury, and she was convicted on some of them. She was acquitted on some of them, and on some of them, the jury was unable to reach a conclusion. So, again, pointing out to an appeal, and obviously we're not counsel in this case and don't have access to any sort of internal deliberations on either side here. But when you have a truly mixed verdict like this, that sets up a real challenge on appeal, because a truly mixed verdict suggests that, the jury really did go through each count and the evidence for each count and either reached conclusions or decided they were unable to reach conclusions on some of the counts.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I guess, maybe to just kind of set the stage for people who aren't familiar with this case, although I think so many people are, it's an interesting case of a very young, dynamic woman, which is interesting in a white collar world, right? There's not that many high profile women who are charged and convicted of white collar crime. But Ms. Holmes was a Stanford dropout, started this company called Theranos. And the idea was to create technology that could test for up to 200 diseases and other types of blood tests with a single drop of blood. And I think at some point, I guess the evidence showed in this case that Ms. Holmes and others at Theranos were actually telling people that they had that technology, that it worked, and including a couple of very large retail pharmacies. So ultimately, there's a huge success story that I guess went awry when the whistleblowers came out, and then the downfall happened. But I mean, this is a company at some point that was valued at $9 billion and ultimately didn't have actually the technology to conduct near the amount of tests that they were claiming that they could do.
That's right. And, this was, before it became a scandal, Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes were incredibly high profile. I think, Forbes magazine at one point described her as, the youngest female self-made billionaire in the country. She was featured in all sorts of entrepreneurial tech startup conferences, and she had a large media presence. And for better or for worse, she received attention for kind of adopting this Steve Jobs-like persona, demeanor, appearance that was striking to both the sort of media that covered the tech startup world and to, venture capitalists and other potential investors, potential board members, potential customers who, were really drawn to her and to the company as something that was revolutionary and that people wanted to be a part of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, she, from all accounts and by looking at news reports, I mean, she was just a very charismatic and a person who just portrayed this, created this persona. And it is interesting to see kind of the Steve Jobs type comparisons, because she did wear the black turtleneck, and some say she even kind of changed how she spoke and took a much lower tone in how she spoke, and pretty interesting there. But no, obviously, smart, intelligent woman, very charismatic, and kind of built this company. And I guess at the end, the problem was she kind of built it on a foundation of lies.
And that was the core of the government's case. And I think it merits pointing out, and you mentioned whistleblowers a moment ago, but at the height of sort of the Theranos appeal and the Elizabeth Holmes appeal, you had this quick flip where a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, who had done a lot of digging, started publishing articles questioning Theranos and questioning Holmes. And ultimately this reporter, John Carreyrou, came out with a book called Bad Blood that I think was published 3 or 4 years ago, that truly seemed as an expose to Theranos and Holmes. And that sort of flipped things overnight, where there was an SEC investigation, there were private civil suits, and then ultimately the criminal charges that culminated in the trial with the verdict that was delivered last week.
Yeah, and we can go through those charges, but kind of just summarizing them, I thought it was pretty interesting that she was found guilty of the charges related to, or at least most of the charges related to, lying to investors. I guess there were 3 that the jury didn't reach a verdict one way or the other. But she was largely acquitted on the charges relating to lying to patients, or even a conspiracy to defraud patients. And so I don't know if that was we're talking about 3 months of trial here. So, depends on kind of what the case was put on by the prosecutors. Clearly here, the jury was focused much more on the evidence they thought the evidence relating to the lying to the investors was much stronger than those relating to the patients. And that could have been, credibility of the witnesses. It could have just been the focus of the prosecutor as the trial went on. So, but I thought that was an interesting kind of overview of how this ended up unfolding, talking about kind of the mixed result here.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, that you have, a guilty conviction on the first count, which related to conspiring with another person named Ramesh Sunny Balwani, who actually was not. He has been indicted. His trial is separate, but he played a large role in absentia in the Holmes case, and we may talk about that in a few minutes. But the narrative that was developed essentially at trial was that Holmes and Balwani together, sort of behind the scenes, decided, even though the technology doesn't work, even though we don't have the blood testing capabilities, we should tout that we have them and use that and go to potential investors with the, model little black box testing device and say, behold, here's the Theranos product and it works, and invest in us because we can sell this thing all over the country and it'll revolutionize blood testing. And, I think if you approach the narrative from that perspective, saying here are 2 people who agreed to do something bad and then they did it, I think at least in the level of here are 2 people who agreed to go pitch investors and say, invest in me because I'm good and my product is great, then if those statements are not true, it really does, fit into a traditional white collar fraud case, whether it's securities fraud or wire fraud. The notion of saying, give me money because I can do something, and in fact you cannot do it, is a pretty good recipe for getting into trouble with the U.S. government.
Yeah, and a lot's been made of, this is, a big case in Silicon Valley, which has the kind of fake it till you make it type of mantra, where, people, kind of come up with these ideas and then they get, sometimes large amounts of money, financial backing to pursue those ideas. And obviously, until you get the money, a lot of times you can't develop that. But looking at the evidence here, I mean, this just went really kind of beyond that, based upon what I've heard and I've seen. Is it wasn't what you and I will sometimes call these forward-looking statements, right? And so the securities laws say, look, you can tell people what you think might happen, but there's some protection there, right? Because you're allowed to kind of tell people, look, this is what we're doing, this is what we hope to achieve, and without fear of violating the securities laws. But here we're saying, they were saying, look, claims such as these devices have been tested in combat. Well, that wasn't true because the devices didn't work. Or the devices, they were telling investors, these are proven devices and they've run these tests when in fact they had never run anything close to 200 tests. And I think the evidence shows that matter of fact, we're having to send blood out to third parties to get results.
Right.
So I mean, these were just these weren't kind of these aspirational, we hope our technology, or we think, or we're very confident our technology will work. It was statements such that it is working. Here's who we have agreements with, and here's what we're doing, when none of that, in fact, was true. So it was very clear that they were lying to investors here based on the evidence I've seen and heard about, and trying to get their money by making just blatantly false claims of what was going on.
Yeah, and certainly from a compliance perspective, sort of moving into some of the work that we do, there's a fairly easy fix to this, which is basically inserting the words, here's what we're trying to do, here's what we think we can do, here's why we think we can do it, rather than saying we've already done it and see we can do it. You may be able to say we can do some of this, but it's the notion of not overselling and underperforming. And of course, this one of the things that came out in this trial, where Matt, you and I can sort of be stickler, curmudgeonly lawyers saying, be careful what you say and how you say it, and pick your words carefully. That kind of mindset, I think this is an example of flying in the face of this sort of, fake it till you make it confidence that founders either naturally exude or want to exude or feel they need to exude to attract startup money, to attract investors, venture capital firms, et cetera, because so much of what's for sale at early stages is not, the end product. The end product isn't there. It's, do we have faith in the founder? And a founder with confidence is perhaps more inspiring than a founder who's, using careful lawyerly terms to describe what they're hoping to do.
Yeah, look, it's hard to think that part of why Elizabeth Holmes became such a sensation is why she ended up getting prosecuted. Because, the question is, well, I mean, look, this isn't the first time that there's been a big flop in Silicon Valley, of big proportions, where lots of investors lost a lot of money. And I'm going to guess that you could go back and find where the founders made all sorts of bold claims that were just patently false. But, it is hard to kind of put aside the fact that, you had a young, dynamic, charismatic woman who got so much attention because of those characteristics, kind of becoming a target here of this prosecution.
Yeah, well, I mean, I certainly think, if Holmes and Theranos had not received so much media attention on its ascendancy, it's far less likely that she and the company would have been subjected to the same level of scrutiny. I mean, at the most basic, if you think about the investigations really getting started with media inquiries and expose articles that were published by the Wall Street Journal saying, wait a second, this unicorn is not all that it appears to be. If you're a quieter, subtler startup that is, even if you're getting a a lot of money from investors, even if you're not, quite as far along in your product development as you say you are. If you're not, attracting attention to yourself, you can probably get away with a lot more. Now, this is not legal advice or capital raising advice that if your product stinks and you're lying about it, to be quiet about it. And
get somebody less dynamic to be your face of them.
Because it really is, the fact that this investigation and trial and conviction happened is probably the product of a lot of different variables that just happened to click into place. I think you're right that there are plenty of other early stage companies that have existed and that probably still exist, where a charismatic founder is espousing the strengths of the company that might not quite be there yet, but he or she are doing it in a way where it's not getting a lot of attention and is giving, ideally, the company time to put that capital to work to turn the vision into something that is real.
Well, one interesting part about this, and probably worth a little bit of discussion, was that Elizabeth Holmes, took the stand in her own defense and testified. I think I saw her. She maybe testified for 7 days. Mm-hmm. Very long testimony given there. I've seen some reports that said that was, remarkably unique. I don't know if it's that unique in white collar cases. It's more common than you would have in other type of more kind of non-white collar cases, but I don't know what your take on that was.
It's a great point. It's I think so much of what white collar cases are about is what was in the mind of the defendant at the time. Right. It were statements that proved to be false, intentionally false, or did the defendant have a good faith basis for believing what, in this case, she said? And, some of the things that came out as part of Holmes' testimony, certainly as part of the defense's case, and are personal issues involving Holmes and aspects of her life, including the impact of, I think, being sexually assaulted or raped while she was a student at Stanford, and that she was subject to verbal and sexual abuse from Sunny Balwani, who's the defendant in the other case and who was charged as her co-conspirator. He's has a separate trial that's starting in about a month or so, facing similar charges. By the way, all reports are that Balwani and his counsel are completely denying any existence of verbal or sexual abuse on Balwani's behalf involving Holmes. So right there, you have sort of two versions of the events, both from two different defendants, essentially charged for the same thing. But the fact that she raised these components to her defense, and that the jury, at least in some of the counts, rejected those arguments or rejected those series of facts, really speaks, I think, to the notion of, okay, yes, bad things can happen to a defendant. The defendant can be in difficult circumstances, but if the defendant is knowingly making false statements that are material and benefiting from them to others' detriment, well, that's enough to convict. I think that the takeaway here is that unless the defense was able to demonstrate that Holmes believed what she was saying was true, not that she felt, I guess not that she felt pressured to say it and went ahead and did it anyway, but that if she didn't actually think they were true, then that was a problem for her. And there are particularly, examples in some of the counts of conviction where, we're talking about really substantial dollar figures. One of the counts involved, I think, a $96 million investment. Another involved some other multiple hundreds of millions of dollar investments in Theranos. These are large numbers, and I think those are numbers that get a jury's attention, and that if a company or if a founder is going to solicit that size of an investment, that really the person soliciting the investment needs to be truthful and will be held accountable for misleading an investor who's made that kind of a commitment.
Yeah. Although I will say, I mean, look, we don't, not that I'm aware of representing anyone involved in this case. One of the things that kind of stuck out to me was the shockingly little amount of due diligence that was done by people on the other side, right? I mean, okay, you have a device that works. Okay, well, show me the device and let me see how it works. I mean, let me see actually run this test. And you had big retail companies and other investors in many cases, kind of believing this, well, it's proprietary and we keep a close hold on that stuff. So kind of, believe us or give us some blood and we'll just kind of end up giving you some results later. I just thought that was an interesting side note on this case.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that closely connects with that, I think is one of the things that differentiates this whole investigation and case from a lot of other startup companies that prove to be unsuccessful, is that in blood testing, you're talking about something that is quite literally life and death. Mm-hmm. And whether there are a full array of regulatory requirements that obligate these items to be, held to a higher standard. I think there's somewhere in a, moral compass, gut sense feeling of things that either investors or investigators or customers believe that things in this space should be, held to a higher standard. So, a startup company that is, touting an app that can do something new and cool and different, that's right. Social media based, maybe, a potential investor, may look at the app and sort of say, okay, that looks fun and kind of neat. Sure, we'll put some money into this. And you don't need to do a ton of due diligence on that. Now, I'm sure there are lots of details about data usage and privacy and whatnot that would merit, deeper diligence. But we're not talking about life and death. But the fact that it was life and death may have taken it outside the normal course of things, and maybe people didn't go through the normal course of things, or maybe people just said, we'll give you the normal type of diligence, and the normal type of diligence is something that wouldn't go to the detail that this would ultimately warrant. And I think the fact that the product didn't work and that people were misled about the product caused a greater degree of outrage because one would trust people creating a blood testing device to, really, really, really want to get it right.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point. And that probably also didn't help Ms. Holmes and Mr. Balwani escape the attention of the Justice Department, right? Lying to people about, whether you can, run tests to determine whether they have certain diseases, there is something different than lying about your newest delivery app that you've created. So Phil, what are your kind of final takeaways from this case?
I mean, I think that the takeaways are, one, to do whatever due diligence you can, but the reality is, if you're going to over diligence things, then you may miss out, because I think the startups that are the most attractive for potential investors know that, and can put pressure on investors to move quickly to make a decision, because investors don't want to get left out. Mm-hmm. So be firm with due diligence to the best you can from the startup side of things. It never hurts to be more careful about what you say and what you promise, and showing off a thing that works or that purports to work and saying, no, really, really, this works, even if it doesn't work, is probably not a great plan, either for legal reasons or for business reasons. But the larger the project, the more attention you attract, the more likely it is that you'll be held to a higher standard. And if you're trying to garner investments at $1 billion plus valuation, you should expect to operate like $1 billion company, and people will expect you to be truthful like $1 billion company and not like a guy running an app shop out of his garage. So scale matters, size of investment matters. And at the end of the day, it's better to be truthful than to be indicted.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, look, I agree with all that. It was a mixed result, but at the end of the day, it's a win for the government, right? I mean, Ms. Holmes is, again, absent some kind of new trial or the appellate court doing something. She's going to go to prison. Ultimately, the judge is never going to stack sentences on top of each other. So she's looking at probably a range of 5 to 10 years. It would be my just gut, given the size of the loss and so forth. But, she faces a maximum of 20 years here. So, I mean, it is a win for the government. I don't think this is going to send reverberations in Silicon Valley. I think they're going to kind of view this as a pretty extraordinary anomaly of a case. But I do think there's some, lessons, right? It's, you do your due diligence. If there are things that you're relying on in your investment that are important to you, get it in writing, make it clear. I mean, you're telling me the following is true. Okay. If I'm making a big enough investment, I should be able to get some of that in writing. So that can be pretty helpful as well. But ultimately, look, I just think this is I hate to say this because this involves, of course, lots of people, and, Ms. Holmes, she has loved ones and so forth because, and it affects, real people, and real people lost money. But, this was it's been made out to this entertaining case, and, you have a lot of podcasts devoted to it and news reports. And it is kind of one of those fascinating kind of, white collar cases. And sometimes they're pretty rare where they kind of capture attention because you had these interesting characters and dynamic characters and these claims and hopes that this young woman was turning into this great entrepreneur power, and kind of see the rise and fall of her gets people's attention. And so I'm not sure ultimately if there's a whole lot to take from this other than, unfortunately, she went over the line on what she was promising people, and ultimately is going to pay the price for it.
No, I think that's right. And it is the classic case of flying too close to the sun and getting burned. And I think that's very much what happened here. So thank you, Matthew. This was good. This is our first sort of quick reaction to a significant white collar development / piece of news. This is something that I think we're going to try to do from time to time when news or circumstances warrant. So listeners, you can look forward to that and lots more in the weeks ahead. And as always, you can subscribe to Sidebar from Bracewell, from the Bracewell webpage, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. So thank you for listening, and stay out of trouble.